Some families are like, oh my God, this is awful. I've got a transgender kid. It doesn't have to be awful. This can be beautiful. Just think about your kid. Forget the label. Your child figured out who they are at this age. Can you imagine that? There are some people still don't know who they are. And
Right.
this is a child. So I think you can celebrate that. And I think it's also okay to acknowledge that it's okay to be sad. It's okay to, in some ways, I believe, mourn the loss of the family you thought you had or the idea of the family. And hopefully you can then embrace and celebrate the new reality.
Hello and welcome to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. We get curious about all things gender, sex, and sexuality, as well as relationships, feminism, the inclusive kind, mental health and kink, and all that makes us humans unique and diverse. From body positivity to body dysmorphia, it's all welcome here. If you like what we do and want to support this podcast, you can become a patron on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/50 Shades of Gender, as in FIFTY. You can also buy us a coffee or make a donation. Links are on the website. You can now register your interest for our upcoming allyship course. Go to 50shadesofgender.com/allyship-course or navigate to the course page via the website menu to be notified when it goes live. Now, join us on a journey of inclusion, acceptance, and respect. I'm your host, Esther Lemons. I am a queer woman, and my pronouns are she and they. In this episode, I have a conversation with Kate Brookes, an author, TV reporter, anchor turned producer, and filmmaker. Kate is a cisgender woman and uses she in her pronouns. She's also the parent of a transgender child. Find out what that means to Kate in this episode. We also talk about the challenges of deciding on a name, being in transition as a family, the privilege of having access to an accepting community, how important it is to be an ally and educate ourselves, that acceptance is protection, and telling stories in a responsible way. Please be aware that there is mention of suicide in this episode. Also, in this conversation, Kate uses her daughter's old pronouns and name, which is a pseudonym, to communicate how she identified at a given time. This is in line with how their story is told in Kate's new book, Transister, Raising Twins in a Gender-Bending World, which was just released on August the 8th. It was recorded on the 3rd of August 2023. Now let's get into the episode. Hello and welcome. What's your name?
Kate Brookes, great
Hello,
to be
Kate.
here.
Yeah, great to have you. So, let's get straight in with the subject we're talking about. So, you're the parent of a transgender child, and you have just written a book about this, which is out on the 8th of August. So, when this airs, it will have come out by then. So, first of all, I wanted to ask you about the title of it. You've called it Transister. And
Yes.
what inspired the title of the book, the name of the title of the book?
Well, the complete title is Transister, Raising Twins in a Gender-Bending World. And
Mm-hmm.
the name came about because at the age of 8, I was walking down the street with my child, who at the time was identifying as male, Gideon.
Mm-hmm.
And we're walking down the street on Broadway on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, holding hands, just enjoying the time together. And he looked at me and said, "Mama, I think I'm a transistor." To which I replied, "Do you mean transgender?" And he said, "Yes, when I was in your tummy, it was a mistake. I was supposed to come out a girl." And in retrospect, I wish I had said, "Oh, baby, nothing about you is a mistake." And I said, "That's okay, Gideon. Mommy and daddy will love you always. If you say you're a girl, you are, and we'll get through this together."
Mm-hmm.
And I'm still not quite sure what I meant by "we'll get through this," as though there was this like magical end line that we were going to go towards and I was going to be so helpful.
Mm.
But I did in that moment. It was scary. And I was really relieved because my child had been grappling with their gender identity for years. And I could at that time only hope that she, and moving forward, I'll refer to her as she,
Mm-hmm.
would be happier because of this. And fast forward several years later, she is indeed happy, healthy, kind, funny, beautiful, fabulous, fierce. And it is still not easy.
Yeah. So I've skimmed through the book somewhat, and I sort of just stopped in different bits and stuff, and just took it all in. And one thing that stood out was like well, several things stood out really. So she went through a few iterations of name, like choosing. So what did she end up choosing, if you're happy to share?
Sure. So she went through 13 names, which was
Whoa.
tough for everybody to keep track of, particularly her twin brother Jacob, who was annoyed by the entire process. Keep in mind, this happened when they were 8 years old. This is when her
Mm,
declaration of being a transistor came out.
yeah.
And I think it was hard for her to land on a name. And ultimately, she needed to land on a name because she was starting at a new school and
Hmm.
she is stealth. And it would attract more attention if you changed your name every day because most students in school at the time, third grade, didn't change their name every day.
Yeah.
So she finally landed on Gabriella.
Hmm.
And it's interesting because she was having a hard time figuring out the name that would ultimately be her name. I mean, most kids don't get the opportunity to name themselves. And she was pretty stressed. And the time our babysitter said, "Wow, Kate, she's really stressed about this." And we needed to have a name because even school was like, "Oh, we're going to wait a few days, but before school starts, we do want to make sure that we put her name on her locker and we want to put her name on the class list." New school. So ultimately, our gender therapist suggested, "Hey, it does sound like she's having a hard time with this. Why don't you give her 4 or 5 name choices to choose from?" Because she had, for months been cycling through names.
Mm.
And we gave her some choices and she said, "I hate all of them." And we said, "Well, why don't you pick the one you hate the least?" And she settled in on Gabriella. So she goes by Gabby G, Gabriella, and we think it's beautiful. And that's how we came to the name. And we have
Yeah.
subsequently, legally changed her name on her birth certificate and her documents because it could be frustrating. It can be frustrating and disconcerting to travel. And you need a passport oftentimes to travel when you're a
Mm.
minor, even domestically. And you
All
don't
right.
want to be misgendered, misnamed, and it very, very stressful. So we absolutely did the name change. And we did it actually during the Trump administration. My husband and I were getting very worried. When we started to see all of the hate that was being spewed by him
Mm.
and some of those around him. And we looked at each other one day and said, "I really think we should get the name changed." And
Mm.
we legally got it changed. And she's never looked back.
Mm. Hmm. How old is Gabriella now?
She is now 14,
14.
entering
Wow.
high school.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she is all that and then some. And I'll be honest, she does not love that she's trans. She
Hmm.
doesn't like being trans. Some trans people are real happy at what I've spoken to them, and they say, "Yeah, I'm proud and happy to be trans." Gabriella is not one of those. She does not like being trans. She hates that she's trans and she's happy. Kind of the dialectic of it
Interesting.
all. She
Yeah.
is happy and she does not like being trans. And I hope over time that changes, just because I hope that she's able to embrace all of her,
Hmm.
whatever that means.
Yeah.
But she is happy, healthy, kind, smart, funny, and as I say, fabulous.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So 6 years, the process, like from when she was 8 to now. So that's a 6 year process, isn't it? So when did you decide to write a book about your experience?
As a writer, I've always been a writer. I'm not sure I knew I was writing a book. I think
Hmm.
I just started writing because sometimes I write to process big things.
Yeah.
And my son realizing she was our daughter seemed like a pretty big thing at the time.
Indeed. Hmm.
And so I started writing, and then it morphed into I really began writing the book that I wish I had had when my child was going through this process.
Hmm.
Not like a prescriptive narrative, if you will, but kind of a raw, candid, sometimes funny, just telling of the story
Hmm.
of our family in transition. And then
Mm.
as I started writing more, then I kind of realized that I think it's incredibly important, particularly now in our society. And I finished the book, a couple of years ago. It takes a while to get published here
Yeah.
in the States. I think representation matters. And I think that there's a lot of hate right now and a lot of questions and fear around gender identity here in the States.
Hmm.
And I think some of the ways to combat the hate is through education, awareness, and the telling of stories. So,
Mm.
in that way, I thought it was pretty important to share our story, albeit in a responsible way. And full disclosure, I use different names in the book.
Hmm.
So the names that I speak are these are pseudonyms because I want to protect my kids' identity, and they're super proud that I've written this book, and they're concerned at the same time, and sometimes
Mm.
bordering on angry. And
Yeah.
I tailor my publicity accordingly. I don't do television, and I have a TV background, so I turn down TV interviews.
Mhm.
There are things that I'm comfortable doing and that I'm not comfortable doing. And the reality is, I know people can quote unquote find us. I'm not scared of that. I just want to honor my kids' privacy. And I always say that
Totally.
my need to write and to share our story and experience doesn't trump their respective needs for privacy. And
Mhm.
candidly, it's a murky line, it's a fine line.
Mhm.
And I do believe that telling stories and normalizing the trans experience can go a long way to towards acceptance.
Mhm.
Still, I acknowledge it's a really fine line
Yeah, yeah, that makes
and a
total
murky
sense.
line.
Yeah, it's tricky to tell a story when there's other loved ones involved who might want, to stay very private about this stuff because it is it's a tender thing, isn't it?
Absolutely. And my
Experiencing.
daughter is stealth. I mean, she tells her best friends that she's trans, but she doesn't and candidly, being trans is one component of her. She's a billion different things. Trans is one of them. And
Mhm.
she knows she is a trans girl. Really though, she's just a girl. She's happy being quote unquote just a girl. And
Mm.
trans is not what defines her.
Mhm.
She's a billion things. She's funny. She's an artist. She's athletic. She's super silly. She loves TikTok. I mean, she loves to play tennis. She loves hanging out with her friends, and she's trans.
Mm.
So, and I think it's awesome when some people decide that they want to be activists and they want to be out on the front lines. And not everybody needs to do that.
That's
So
right.
we're kind of following her lead, and
Mhm.
maybe one day she will want to be quote unquote on the front lines, and we'll respect that, and maybe she never will, and we will respect that.
Yeah.
We just truly want her, both of our kids, to be happy, healthy, kind, and
Mm.
whatever that means for them, we're on board.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking back to some of the stuff I was reading in your book about your son having real trouble with accepting the transition, of accepting his sibling as a sister.
He really
Yeah,
did have a lot of trouble at first, and if you
yeah.
think about it, he was 8 years old.
Hmm.
And I think it's a lot. I mean, at the time I was 40 something, and it was a lot for my husband and I to kind of take
Hmm.
in. And I think I kind of analyze it like this. My daughter was getting to be her authentic self. My husband and I, we got to have a kid who was going to live and thrive, because statistically, if you are not comfortable in your identity and not true to your gender identity, and or you are not accepted, bad things can happen. Greater chance of suicide, greater chance of homelessness, greater chance of mental illness issues. So
Hmm.
our daughter gets to be her authentic self. We get a child who's going to be happy and be able to thrive. And our son kind of felt like, I'm getting bupkis in this deal. I'm getting nothing. I'm losing my twin brother.
Hmm.
And over time, we hoped that he would realize he was gaining a happier sister. And he
Hmm.
has, I'm happy to report. Again, I started writing this
Yeah.
when the kids were about 9. And the book really only goes from childhood, from birth until 9. Now they're 14, and they're uber close, and they love each other tremendously. And both kids have come a long way on the spectrum of acceptance. And it was
Hmm.
really hard. And as a someone who perceived himself, our son Jacob, as kind of like a stereotypical guy's guy who was into sports, there were times when he would get teased, even when he thought his sister was his brother, when she identified as a boy but liked pink and purple stuff and wore tutus and was into Barbies. Sometimes kids would make fun of Jacob and be like, "Oh my gosh, do you like Barbies like your brother?" And that was
Mm.
hard. And at
Yeah.
8 years old, it can be a lot to take in. But again,
Hmm.
proud to say that all of us kind of went through a process of different therapy and talking to people and support groups, which I am a big proponent of, because I think it's scary to go through any big change alone. And
Mm.
again, I would argue this is a pretty big change for a family dynamic. And I think
Definitely.
through all of that, I think we've all learned to be kind of kinder, gentler, more accepting people, as has Jacob. And I think just as he
Hmm.
goes out into this world, I could not be any more proud And I think he was always an empathetic little man. I call him my gentle giant. At 14, he's 5'9" and hasn't even hit puberty yet. So he hasn't even had a growth spurt yet. And he's
Yeah.
taller than me. And he's just my gentle giant. And I think he's gonna bring a lot to this world. He would have if he didn't have a trans sibling. And because he does, I think that's going to even make him more empathetic and give him
Mm.
more character, if you will.
Yeah, yeah. Because one section of the book, it's called Our Transition. So it's very much a process that not just Gabriella went through, but like you all went through together.
You
Yeah.
know, as I'm fond of saying, one of the best support groups that we were able to go to was a group called the Gender Family Project here
Hmm.
in New York City at the Ackerman Institute for the Family, which provides therapy to families on a spectrum of things. But the GFP, Gender Family Project, was run by a man named Jean Malpass. And there were groups for gender nonconforming and trans kids, for parents, for siblings, now even caregivers and other family members who are not just the nuclear family.
Hmm.
And he always said, when one child transitions, the whole family transitions along with them, at
Mm.
least in a perfect scenario. Because if
Hmm.
everyone transitions together, it means things are going well. So
Yeah.
really, it was a big change for our whole family. And it
Mm.
was scary, and I won't minimize that. And while I knew that this was, I truly believed and still know this was best for our daughter because, I mean, she knows who she is and we're so proud of her. Any transition is super hard, particularly a transition that changes a family dynamic where names are involved, where gender is involved, where people have preconceived notions. And sometimes people, and you from doing this podcast, you probably know, no one wants to feel like the other. And there's a lot of
Mm.
othering out there. And
Yeah.
some people think this is crazy and not healthy and it's wrong. And I don't partake in any of the arguments. I don't try to convince anyone. I just know that
Mm.
this is our reality. This is our family's truth. This is our daughter's truth. And while transitions can be difficult, it can also be beautiful. And
Hmm.
this falls into that category.
Yeah.
And beautiful doesn't always mean easy, because let's be honest, this we went, this was tough.
Yeah.
It was tough, and life is tough,
Yeah.
regardless of whether you are trans or have a trans sibling or whether you are on the gender spectrum. Life is hard.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. What did you find the most challenging in your journey?
I think the most challenging initially was honestly our son feeling comfortable, because I have a chapter called Odd Man Out. He felt like the odd man out. Again, he felt like he was not getting anything in this deal and kind
Mm.
of felt left out. That was the most difficult. And again, over time, we've remedied that. Luckily, fortunately, we're in a bubble here. We're in New York City, and our circle is very accepting, and there are a lot of allies. And I know that that is not the case for so many people in the United States for trans kids. My
Hmm.
daughter has access to gender affirming care, whether that means therapy or ultimately she went on puberty blockers and now hormones. And I'm not sure if you've been tracking where you are, but in the United States right now, there's, depending on which stats you follow, whether it's the ACLU or the Trans Legislation Tracker, somewhere between 490 and 560 anti-trans laws have been proposed here in the United
Mm.
States. And that's really scary. So my daughter is, we're lucky in that she's in a bubble where there's a lot of affirmation.
Hmm.
And still, so the acceptance wasn't the issue. I think the changing of the family dynamic was pretty hard.
Hmm.
And I acknowledge, and again, I don't think that there's any privilege in being trans. I think it's hard, even if you, I mean, I hope my daughter ends up loving being trans and just who she is. But we do have privilege because we are in, it shouldn't be a privilege, but she's in a family who loves and affirms her and
Hmm.
respects her gender identity. Not always the case for people.
Hmm.
We are live in a community that is largely full of allies, and she goes to a school where they don't just talk the talk, but they walk the talk and are affirming. And she's got access to gender affirming healthcare. So those things are fabulous. So for us, it was really just more the dynamic. But yes, we absolutely lost friends and we absolutely heard hateful remarks. But to me, that's not the most difficult part. Because
Interesting.
if someone is, and we lost friends who we considered family,
Mm.
and not many. But to us, kind of, if you're not on board with this, then I don't mean this callously, but but good riddance, because this is our
Mm.
family and you support us, or you don't. But if you don't, we don't need you in our lives. So yes, that was could be sad initially, but when push comes to shove, we found lots more support than we did the opposite. And again, not to beat a dead horse, we are lucky. And there's so many people in this, I mean, all these private message groups and private support groups where kids are not affirmed at home or they can't get the health care they need. I've made friends all over the country, and people reach out to me, and because I remember what it was like feeling alone and not having that many people to talk to in this position as a mom.
Mm-hmm.
And so anytime someone wants to talk, I'm always happy to talk. A couple months ago, a mom friend of mine from Florida called in tears because her daughter's doctor refused to treat her anymore. And her puberty blocker, the efficacy was about to wear off. She's
Mm-hmm.
about to go on hormones. Doctor said can't do anything. Immediately, I called our endocrinologist here in New York City. We were able to get her and her daughter an appointment. They flew to New York City,
Wow.
got the puberty blocker replaced. But again, what about the people who can't afford to jump on a plane
Mm-hmm.
to get that care? So it really is becoming it's becoming scary. Not just the hate rhetoric; it can be awful,
Mm-hmm.
but I truly believe that gender affirming healthcare saves lives, and I think legislators who are targeting trans youth really can be responsible for taking lives, because
Yeah.
we all have seen the statistics that suicidality is higher among trans youth who are not affirmed. And if you take away that affirmation and that gender affirming healthcare, I think you're really going down an evil, terrible, horrible path.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I point out that I really do think that my daughter is lucky, and I'm generally not a fan of bubbles because I don't think they're representative of the real world.
Mm.
But at 14 years old, my daughter's 14, I am grateful for her bubble. And
Mm-hmm.
she knows that it's not like this everywhere. And as she gets older, we have more deeper conversations and more complex conversations, and conversations that we didn't have when she was 8 that would have been perceived as way too scary. And even now and probably inappropriate. But as she ages, we have more age appropriate conversations. The irony is that there is nothing age appropriate about hate. And we
Right.
still have to have those conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. That's such a good point. So, from going through the book in my own way, one thing I was curious about is obviously in telling the story, it is tricky because you want to affirm your child and use the right name and pronouns. But obviously, in telling the story, you go by, I guess, their. Did you say you just made up some names? So I don't know if it's their actual dead name or if it's a
So
made up one, but
it
like
it is a pseudonym.
a pseudonym.
Um,
Okay, yeah,
and but it
yeah,
was a conscious choice. And are you going to ask
yeah.
how I chose about using pronouns and
Yeah, so obviously, in telling the story, it would be confusing to try and tell the story from the perspective of who she is now. So I totally appreciate, making
And
it
I've gotten a
more.
lot of pushback about that. Some people are like,
Yeah, yeah,
oh,
yeah,
you've used the dead name. How could you
yeah,
use the dead name?
mm,
For me, and every family's different, so
yeah, yeah,
I'm
yeah.
not good. And everyone has different preferences. And I can just
Hmm.
say, in writing this book and in telling our family story, it was important for me to kind of identify my child how she identified in a given time.
Yeah.
So at the time, she was Gideon to us. At the
Mm,
time, she used male pronouns. But as the book transpires
yeah.
over this time continuum, as she realized that she was a she,
Hmm.
I started changing the pronouns. And then the book's told into three parts. There's,
Mm,
pre-transition, transition, post. They're not called that, but they're called something else, the different parts. But as she aged and as she figured out who she was, I refer to her historically with the name and pronouns that she was going by at the time.
hmm.
And I know that doesn't work for lots of folks, at least those who I've spoken with in the trans world. And
Hmm.
when I'm in front of my daughter, we'll have conversations. If I'm telling a story, or if we're talking about a time where she was identified by Gideon and not Gabriella, I will say to her, is it okay if I use your previous name? Would you prefer? I literally ask her. And
Hmm.
sometimes she does not want to hear the name, and sometimes she's okay with it.
Hmm.
Um, and I fully acknowledge that for some people who read this book, they will be like, I can't believe this mother has dead named her child. And I
Mm.
respect that perspective as well.
Mm.
I think there's a lot of nuance in life in general.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of the nuances, and this is how I chose to tell the story. And I hope in doing so that I haven't offended many people. And I acknowledge that some people will be offended and question.
Hmm.
And like with so many things, there's like a murky middle sometimes, and you can't always get it right for everybody.
That's true.
And
Yeah.
everyone's different. And I'm sure you found this out. I mean, there's no one trans experience, there's no
Hmm.
one non binary experience. There are different experiences. And this is how I shared our experience.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I guess the main thing is it's consensual within your family bubble as as such. Yeah.
Correct. And
So
that's
it's
how
all
we kind of tell stories, if you
yeah.
will.
Yeah,
And,
totally.
and it's also, to be honest, it's different when I'm with my daughter than when I'm not with my daughter.
Hmm.
And for some people, historical context plays in.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
it
that
can be
makes
different
sense.
for everyone. And
Yeah.
and it also makes sense if someone never wants to hear a dead name.
Hmm.
I mean, that makes sense too. I really just think it depends on the person. I think it depends on the circumstance. And I honor and respect all those viewpoints. This happens to be mine.
Yeah.
And I come at this from a cisgender heterosexual perspective. So, I mean, again, that is the vantage point from which I'm telling this story.
Hmm.
So, and to be candid, this is my story. My daughter and my son will have their own stories, whether they choose to share them or not. This
Hmm.
is my perspective, and not everything in here is what. Even when I read passages to my husband, he's like, "Yeah, no, that's actually how it went." Oh, yeah, you totally got my what I said correct when I quote him. And if
Hmm.
I didn't, he was like, "No, I think I said it like this," because I remember quotes.
Hmm.
But he might tell this story different. My daughter might tell this story different. My son, this is a mother's memoir,
Yeah.
and I wouldn't say take that with a grain of salt, but maybe take that with a grain of salt. This is my perspective.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I liked what you said in the beginning. It's a really raw and vulnerable sharing because also you share really honestly about your what you initially thought about. You went to see some drag performers and you talked about what you thought at the time, and now that might make you feel like, oh god, that is so bad.
Yeah, I mean,
And yeah.
I thought it was weird. I
Mm.
thought it was like, oh my gosh, who would want to be performing, quote unquote, like this?
Mm.
And and then part of me and still wonders, and I may get some pushback for this.
Mm.
Was this the only job that these folks could get, or is this the job they wanted and this is awesome, they got to perform and be who they are?
Mm.
Were these folks, these performers, were they affirmed in their home? Were they kicked out of their home? Did some
Mm.
of them not have surgery because they love their body the way it is and they're okay with, is it okay if I use real words?
Yeah.
If they, if did some of them love their breasts and the fact that they had a penis? Or were they not able to get surgery? Because I think you can be a girl with a penis, you can be a boy with a vagina, you can be whoever you say you are and identify, and that looks different for everybody.
Mm.
But in retrospect, I'm like, wow. I mean, I hope these people were affirmed. I hope they were doing this because this is what they wanted to do. And this is fun. And the performative art was amazing for them. And they got to be expressive.
Hmm.
And I don't know.
Yeah.
But at the
Yeah.
time, I mean, I'm going to be blunt. I thought it was weird. I'm like, this is weird.
Mm.
Um, and
Yeah.
now I don't think of it as weird. I think of it as natural, as natural as I am being a cisgender woman. It's just as natural for my daughter to be transgender
Mm.
because that's
Mm.
who she is. And I think life is always happier and better when you embrace who you are. I mean, I'm all for change and improvement and improving upon the model and doing the work to make ourselves, quote unquote, better and to
Hmm.
function more effectively. But when you can embrace who you are, that's a gift. And I
Yeah.
always say that my daughter has this sense of self that I both envy and admire.
Mm.
And I think
Yeah.
she has a sense of self at age 14 that now I'm 52. I don't know that I'll ever have that sense of self that she has.
Mm.
And I honor that and respect that and applaud that and think it's beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. So I can imagine you discovered or maybe learned a thing or two about like gender roles, because as I've been, getting to meet more people who are trans, non-binary, and otherwise gender non-conforming, all of a sudden you see a lot of like misogyny and all that stuff. So yeah, so it's probably a good time to ask you like what does it mean to you to be a woman, and has this changed like as you've gone through this journey with your family?
It's interesting because I write this in the book that when I was a little girl, I probably by today's standards could have been considered gender nonconforming
Hmm.
because I didn't like Barbie dolls. I liked G.I. Joe. I played sports. I didn't like wearing dresses. I have an older brother who I wanted to be just like, and I never felt particularly feminine.
Hmm.
As time has worn on, I think what is a woman, what is a man, what is feminine, what is masculine, I think it varies for everybody. To me, I always joke that to me, being feminine is sugar and spice and everything fierce, fabulous, and wonderful and strong. To me, femininity can be strength. It is, I think it's individualized. It's what do you believe is feminine? To me, I think it's so important to be strong emotionally. For me, I like to be physically strong. I love to play sports. Still at 52, I played tennis this morning. Cut it
Hmm.
short for this interview. Happy to do so. I don't know that there are specific gender roles. I mean, in my house, the joke is that my husband does more of the grocery shopping. He does more of the organizing. He does more of the cleaning. And he's a manly man, whatever that means. I'm not as concerned with gender roles as I am with people just feeling comfortable in their own skin. So I think but yes, I mean, I grew up with a dad who was a 6'5" all American guy, played football and basketball and baseball. He loves my daughter more than anything. Didn't
Hmm.
understand this at first, and he's turning 80. And if he didn't understand, I remember he called me one day. He's like, Kate, I've been doing a lot of reading, and people can be born like this. I'm like, "Wow, yeah, Dad, yeah, no, they absolutely can." But
Yeah.
in my house, he was like the manly man,
Hmm.
and I think gender is how you feel, and I think there is a spectrum, and I think there's a continuum, and obviously gender is different than sexuality, and some people feel that their gender is fluid, and it is. So I think it really is a spectrum, and I think I had to learn that. And there was a lot of time, if I'm being honest, when I was a little girl, and even in my 20s and somewhat 30s, I was like, I wish I was more feminine. I wish I was more of a girly girl. I'm really just comfortable with who I am. And it's really funny because when my
Hmm.
daughter was 3 and presented then as my son, she would say to me, Mommy, you're not a girly girl. And I'm like, No, I'm not." And she's like, Mommy, you're not a fancy mom. And I'm like, I am decidedly not a fancy mom. And I can dress up and get my hair blown out and do makeup and I'm just not. And I don't think that not being a fancy mom makes me any less feminine or any less of a woman than
Hmm.
someone who does love to dress to the nines and, wear makeup all the time and wear dripping jewelry.
Hmm.
I think I think everybody's different. And I go back to, I think however you are comfortable, go for it. Long as you're not hurting anybody, go for it. Be your
Hmm.
authentic self. And that's what I learned in a lot of ways from my daughter
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
from my son, if I'm being honest, because he's authentically himself.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, totally. Do you have any advice for, well, obviously reading the book would be one word of advice or many words of advice, but like, what would be your main advice for people who are starting this journey with their family?
So I would say ask questions, read, do research, kind of just immerse yourself as much as you can, because I mean, listen, I knew what puberty blockers were before, but I knew that they were used for precocious puberty. When my friend's daughter was 8 and started getting boobs and they didn't want her to get her period and stop growing because she was only 4'7", they put her on puberty blockers. I didn't know that that's what
Mm.
often trans kids went on. So I would say educate yourself and get support. To me and for our family, maybe it's different for every family, we all needed support, because with big changes come big questions, big feelings, and even good change causes anxiety and stress. I mean, when people get married, it's a change, it can be stressful. When people get the job they've always dreamed of, it can be stressful. So
Mm.
we sought out, therapy, and we asked questions. And for parents, I would check in on your kids, ask them how they're doing, whether it is the child that is questioning their gender or it is the sibling. Check in. How are you? How are you feeling? What does this mean to you? How was your day? Just continually check in.
Mm.
And for parents with a gender questioning and or trans child, accept your child, accept your child, accept your child, and affirm them. Again, it goes back to acceptance is protection, on so many levels. Acceptance is protection emotionally, socially, often physically. We need to accept and affirm our children. And I'm not a big statistic person. And I'm going to, was recently a study, I think it was in 2016, a study that compared a group of cisgender teens to a group of transgender teens who were affirmed. And
Mm.
the mental health outcomes for these two groups were very similar. Yes, there could be a cisgender teen who was depressed. Yes, there could be a transgender teen who was depressed. But if the trans youth were affirmed, their outcomes, their chances, and their ability to thrive were the same as their cisgender counterparts. I
Mm.
would opine these days it's I think there's a lot more stress, and it can be a lot more difficult if you turn on the news, because there is a lot of anti-trans rhetoric. And if you can't get the affirming healthcare that you need, I think that adds another layer of stress and the
Mm.
ability to really diminish mental health outcomes. But I again, so for families, research, talk, get support, question, affirm, and check in on one another. Because even though this can be, some families are like, oh my God, this is awful, I've got a transgender kid. It doesn't have to be awful. This can be beautiful. Just think about your kid. Forget the label. Your child figured out who they are at this age. Can you
Mm.
imagine that? There are some people still don't know who they are. And this
Right.
is a child. So I think you can celebrate that. And I think it's also okay to acknowledge that it's okay to be sad. It's okay to, in some ways, I believe, mourn the loss of the family you thought you had, or the idea of the family. And hopefully you can then embrace and celebrate the new reality.
Mm.
I mean, I look back at the first 8 years of my kids' lives, and there were still wonderful, happy times in there. And there were some times where my daughter was really struggling, and I think it was because she was grappling with her gender identity.
Mm.
But I think it's okay, and I think parents and siblings shouldn't be shamed or made to feel badly because it's hard for them,
Mm.
because they're mourning a loss. That's okay. You might be just mourning the loss of an idea. The idea was wrong, but I mean, think about my brother was hoping that he was going to be a professional baseball player when he was 10. He had to mourn the loss of realizing he's not good enough to play in college, let alone be a professional. We all mourn different losses.
Mm.
But I thank God that I don't have to mourn the actual loss of my child, because my
Mm.
daughter is happy and healthy and thriving. And I'd much rather mourn an idea than mourn a person. And
Wow.
I celebrate and love and embrace both of my kids every day. And I think if that's a little, not to get too deep, but that's a little bit of perspective. Because again, if you don't affirm your child, if you don't accept your child, I'd hope you love your child. They might not be your child for forever. I mean, the statistics are scary.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that would be my advice.
Wow. Yeah. I love that, especially that last bit. That made me tingle. Gosh. Yeah. Is there anything that you would like to add that we haven't talked about yet?
I think that it's important that people who are not in the LGBTQ community, people who are not identify with the trans community, people who don't have a friend or a family member who is trans, you still need to be an ally. You still need to be educated. If you're out at a bar, if you're out on the street and you hear somebody make a mean or a hateful or an inaccurate comment, correct them, because education, awareness, that's going to break up the hate. And it's not enough for folks in the LGBTQ circle to do all the work. It's not. Everyone has to do the work. And I would also just say, just remember that there is, like, my daughter has a cajillion components to her. The fact that she's trans is one of them. Really, she's a person. We are all people. So I think, if you want to label yourself fabulous, I happen to be a cisgender woman, but I don't walk down the street saying, "Hi, I'm Kate, I'm a cisgender woman." Just remember, people are human beings. Treat them as such. And if someone tells you their pronouns, honor them. Also, if somebody is new to your circle and they've maybe recently switched pronouns, if you mess up, and we all make mistakes. I mean, I call my kids by the wrong names and the wrong pronouns all the time, and I don't know that it has anything to do with one being trans. It's just I'm a mom, and that's what we do. We confuse everything. But if you mess up a pronoun, you don't need to give a 10-minute dissertation of apology of why you've messed up. Oh, my apologies. Move on. She, her. Just go on. Nobody needs to hear your 10-minute explanation of why you messed up. But yeah, so I think people need to be allies. People need to speak up, and people need to educate themselves, regardless of whether your kid is trans, regardless of whether you have a friend or a family member. Because I think in our world, I think sometimes people have lost that sense of humanity. And I think getting to know your neighbor, whoever they might be, is part of being human and part of being kind. And I go back to when I was having kids, when my husband and I were talking about having kids, we were not discussing whether they would be trans or cisgender. Our goal was happy, healthy, kind. And I think that's our goal in raising our kids, is for them to be happy, healthy, kind. And I like to treat people the way I want to be treated. And I just remember that people are human. And I think we all want the same things, and we all want to be accepted and affirmed. I mean, as a cisgender woman, I want people to accept me and affirm who I am. I don't think it's any different for anybody in the trans community or anybody on the gender spectrum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I've talked to a few non-binary folks who are mostly those assigned female at birth.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them, several came to mind that came out with something like, I felt like I was being a woman wrong. Or they were like queer women, or they somehow still identified with the term woman. I'm not quite sure. I'll have to think back or listen back. But yeah, it's like, if you're not a woman in a particular way, then basically you're doing it wrong. There's all that stuff.
A friend of mine who has a trans daughter, she and her daughter have made this collection of shirts that just say, "You be you." And I just like that. Just you be you. If everyone can just be who they are and kind of forego the expectation or the shoulds, or do I fit into this box or that box, I think the world will be a happier, healthier, kinder place.
For definite. Yeah.
But I will say, one thing that I would add is that my daughter is happy, and she's a rock star. And there are still days that are hard. I mean, she struggles with body parts that she does not want. And one day she will have the opportunity to get gender affirmation surgery, also known as gender reassignment surgery. And I've said to her, "Sweetheart, you can be a girl and have a penis." She's like, "That's great, Mom, but I don't want it." And some girls are happy with a penis. So again, I think it's important to kind of meet people where they're at. But my point is that there are days that are difficult for her. Getting dressed can be difficult, and she's still happy, and she still loves herself. And those things are not mutually exclusive. But these days, and I don't know, I'm guessing it always has been, depending on what community you're in, even in an affirming community, even in our bubble, there are things that are hard. There are things that are hard. And I think her life will be richer and probably more beautiful because of who she is. And it can be hard.
Yeah.
But again, I would say also, I hate to beat a dead horse, acceptance is protection. Accept your kids, accept your neighbors, and if someone tells you this is who they are, don't try to change it. Kind of believe them. Believe it. I say, this is who I am, you're not going to question me, right?
Nope.
Yeah, my daughter told me who she was. And so, wow, I love you just as much as I did yesterday, and I probably love you more every day.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing, Kate.
My
Yeah.
absolute pleasure. Thanks for chatting with me.
Yeah. All the best with the book. I hope it does well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Are you going to do a book tour and stuff like that, did you say?
Well, I'm doing some promotional stuff for it, and I
Mm.
have to be pretty selective
Yeah.
because I just, again, I didn't write to become a bestseller. I
Mm.
wrote first to just it because it was therapeutic, then because I really wished I had had this book, then because I think it's important to share stories.
Mm.
I'm hoping, though, that it will end up being a vehicle for me to. I've already started speaking to groups. I want to talk to schools. I want to talk to churches, synagogues, camps, because there are now more kids who are at least acknowledging their gender identity. I don't
Mm.
know that there's more people who are trans than there were. I think more people are acknowledging their authentic selves,
Mm.
and I think that there's work that schools have to do, camps have to do, different groups have to do
Yeah.
to get a better understanding of what this means and what it doesn't mean.
Mm.
And I always tell people, I am not an expert. I am not the doctor. I am not the trans person. I am a mother who's going along on this ride with my family. And as such, I might be able to offer some perspective that can be helpful to you.
Mm.
Not replacing the trans individual, not replacing the doctor or the therapist, but I may be able to offer another perspective that could be helpful for you. And that's really my hope, is just to talk to more people and spread awareness, and ultimately to do that so that more of our trans folks are accepted and not treated as the other,
Mm.
because they're not.
Yeah, that's right. That's our common goal. Indeed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
You can find out more details on the website at 50shadesofgender.com/Kate, where you can also read the transcript. And you can find Kate on her website, transistermom.com, and on Twitter at transistermom. Further links are on the episode page. Thank you for listening to the 50 Shades of Gender podcast. You can find us online at 50shadesofgender.com, on social media, and on YouTube. Again, if you'd like to support us, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/50 Shades of Gender. You can also buy us a coffee or make a donation. Links are on the website. Remember to register your interest for our upcoming allyship course. Go to 50shadesofgender.com/allyship-course, or navigate to the course page via the website menu to be notified when it goes live. We hope you will listen again. Until then, stay curious and open-minded.
I
Nice.
hope that was okay.
That was good. Yeah, I really
Awesome.
enjoyed it. Yeah,
Thank you.
amazing. Yeah.
It's funny. I do
Yeah,
get a lot of questions and a lot of backlash about the pronouns.
interesting.
And I had a quote unquote sensitivity read, not just not just for my publisher,
Yeah.
but I gave it to someone in the community and they actually had things to say that I hadn't thought of. I mean,
Yeah.
sometimes I'm slightly flippant and I use humor, sometimes as a deflection, sometimes
Mm.
I think things are easier to. I think you can disarm people in a good way sometimes with humor.
Hmm.
But I remember I was like, oh, when he became a she. And she was like, no, no, he didn't become a she. He realized he was a she. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, you're right. I mean, things like that.
Yeah.
And again, and the pronouns has been a big question.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I don't know that there's a right answer. And I probably will piss some people off. But
Mm.
I piss some people off in my
Well,
everyday
you
life
can do
just
that
being
without even trying, right? You can,
right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
For
that will
things
happen,
nothing to do with gender.
right? Totally.